Greetings, everyone. A statue of the Virgin Mary, suspended over 15 feet in the air, descended but remained miraculously intact. The officiating priest fell to his knees, and the young girl who had touched it subsequently vanished. The events that transpired in that secluded American settlement defy scientific explanation, finding solace only in the realm of faith. Nestled in a tranquil pocket of West Virginia, amidst rolling hills that resemble folded prayers and valleys frequently shrouded in morning mist, stands a weathered wooden chapel. Its white paint is peeling, and the bell tower bears the marks of rust. Once known as Our Lady of Grace, this sanctuary had echoed with wedding vows, witnessed baptisms, and seen even the most hardened hearts seek solace in prayer. However, by the year 2023, it had become a mere shadow of its former glory. Services were held for unoccupied pews, and candles burned more from ingrained habit than from genuine devotion. The accumulated dust on the altar cloths grew thicker with each passing week, and the faint echoes of past worship seemed to murmur a lament of being forgotten. Presiding over this solemn scene was Father John Mallister, a man who had known the harsh realities of war, having served as a Marine in the Middle Eastern deserts. Yet it was here, within the embrace of the Appalachian Mountains, that he had chosen to dedicate his life in quiet service, delivering sermons in a chapel that no longer possessed a choir or a congregation, only the slow march of time. His days were governed by routine. Every Sunday, irrespective of the weather, he would unlock the chapel's protesting wooden doors at 6 in the morning. He would meticulously arrange the same white linen upon the altar, ignite the familiar incense, and stand beneath the enduring image of the Virgin Mary, a hand-carved figure brought from Italy in 1905. For over a century, she had resided in an iron niche high above the altar, her arms eternally outstretched, her gaze fixed in perpetual serenity. Yet, everything changed on September 8th, the day commemorating the Nativity of Mary. The morning unfolded with its usual character, a pervasive fog, a damp chill, and a profound quietude that seemed to absorb all sound. Father John moved through the chapel with a spectral presence himself, whispering prayers and gently caressing the worn wood of each pew, as if trying to recall the souls who had once occupied them. He anticipated another solitary Sunday. But then she entered. A young girl, no older than 10 years old, clad in a white dress and barefoot, a rosary encircling her neck. Her footsteps made no discernible sound. She remained silent, proceeding directly to the third pew, where she sat with perfect stillness, her gaze fixed upon the altar and the statue. Father John had never encountered her before, neither within the church, nor in the town, nor anywhere else. There was an aura about her, simultaneously calming and disquieting, as if she were a visitor from another realm, yet not an intruder. He offered a nod. She did not reciprocate. And thus the Mass commenced. A priest, a young girl, and an enveloping silence. What transpired next would prove to be the pivotal moment for the entire community of Coldwater Ridge. It would reignite not only their attendance at the chapel, but also their connection to something deeper, something long dormant: faith. And it all began with a fall that caused no damage, a girl who departed without using the door, and a miracle that, while unrequested, was profoundly needed. Coldwater Ridge had not always been a place of such quietude. Decades prior, the clatter of horse hooves had resonated along its narrow dirt pathways, and church bells had pealed with a resonance capable of rousing even the most reluctant farmers. Children, attired in sturdy work clothes, would race each other up the chapel steps, and elderly gentlemen, sporting dusty boots, would tip their hats as they passed the statue of the Virgin positioned outside. In those days, Our Lady of Grace was more than a mere edifice. It was the very heart of the town. Perched atop a gentle incline, its steeple was visible from almost every dwelling and every field. The interior oak pews, polished to a gleam, were once meticulously maintained. And on Sundays, families would fill the sanctuary, shoulder to shoulder, their presence marked by the comforting scent of pine soap and freshly baked biscuits. The air was perfumed with the aroma of candle wax, incense, and the faint hint of coffee wafting from the side hall following the service. The statue of the Virgin Mary, an import from Italy, placed with trembling hands by the earliest settlers, stood in silent prominence above the altar. Local law held that she had prevented the collapse of the mine during the 1930s. Others firmly believed she had protected the children during a widespread measles epidemic. Regardless of the veracity of these tales, the community held a collective conviction in her protective power. However, the passage of time inevitably dims even the most ardent flames. As the decades advanced, the mine ceased operations, and factory employment dwindled. Families, gathering their cherished memories, relocated to places like Ohio and even as far as Texas. Those who remained grew older, their physical faculties diminished, their eyesight failing. The chapel, once vibrant with life, began to experience an internal emptiness. The white paint on its wooden exterior flaked away like aging bark, and the bell tower emitted groans with every strong gust of wind. Inside, the once polished pews were now marred by cracks. Dust accumulated on altar cloths that had not been disturbed in years. Father John, undeterred, continued his ministry. Every Sunday, every holy day, through rain or shine, even when the only audible sound was the reverberation of his own voice against the stone walls, he never faltered. He always lit the altar candles, never omitted a single line from the liturgy, even when attendance dwindled to a mere 3 parishioners, or sometimes none at all. He would read scripture to empty benches with the same profound reverence he once showed to a full congregation. His voice, barely audible, would sing the psalms, as if imploring the very walls to retain the sacred words. Yet, perhaps the most poignant silence was not emanating from the chapel itself, but from the town as a whole. The residents, though perhaps still holding on to their beliefs, did so without the fervent intensity of previous generations. Faith in Coldwater Ridge had become a subdued affair, more a matter of tradition than conviction, more a remembrance than a vibrant practice. Children now opted for football on Sundays instead of attending Mass, and elders chose to light candles in their homes rather than make the trek up the hill to the church. And the statue of the Virgin, from her perch in the iron niche above the altar, silently observed this gradual fading, her gaze cast downward, her arms open as if still awaiting a return. She had endured storms, winters, and years of unanswered prayers. Father John, too, had waited. Until that particular morning in September, when a mysterious young girl emerged from the mist, when the impossible unfolded, and when Our Lady of Grace, long overlooked, seemed to awaken anew. September 8th dawned like any other quiet Sunday in Coldwater Ridge, with gray skies, heavy dew, and a fog so dense it gave the impression the old chapel was suspended above the earth. It was the feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, a date that most in town had long since forgotten, but which Father John always remembered. For him, It was not merely another observance on the calendar, but one of the few remaining that still held a sense of sanctity, one that warranted preparation, even in the absence of attendees. At 5:30 in the morning, he opened the chapel, as was his custom. The wooden door creaked as if reluctant to confront another empty pew. Inside, the air was cold and motionless. He lit the altar candles, meticulously wiped the dust from the chalice, and arranged his worn white vestments, reserved exclusively for Marian feasts. He even prepared an extra pot of coffee in the parish hall, a gesture of hopeful hospitality. Yet, deep within, he harbored no expectations. He anticipated silence, and for a time, silence was all he received. This continued until the door again emitted a soft creak. No wind stirred, no footsteps echoed, yet somehow someone had entered. A girl, no more than 10 years old, proceeded slowly down the central aisle. She was dressed in a simple white gown, her dark hair cascading gently over her shoulders. Around her neck hung a wooden rosary, appearing handcrafted, each bead worn smooth as if through countless prayers. She uttered no words, neither glancing left nor right, exhibiting no signs of confusion or shyness. Her demeanor possessed a stillness usually associated with saints or shadows. She came to a halt precisely at the third pew, in the center aisle, and took a seat. The old wood emitted no sound. Her footwear made no noise. Only her presence, quiet and distinct, filled the space. Father John stood frozen behind the altar. He was familiar with every child in the surrounding area, having baptized most of them, instructed them in catechism, and offered them candy from the same jar after Mass. This girl, however, was an unknown, and it seemed improbable that she would have traversed the steep hill alone at this hour, unless some unseen force had guided her. Clearing his throat, he attempted to speak gently. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice betraying a tremor he wished to conceal. The girl turned her gaze towards him, her eyes dark, gentle, and profound, and offered a subtle smile. She did not respond, nor did she blink, but merely smiled, as if fully aware of her purpose there. The priest felt an unfamiliar sensation stir within his chest. A sense of peace, yet not entirely comfort, a feeling of awe, but devoid of fear. He commenced the liturgy, his voice subdued, his hands steady, but his heart filled with uncertainty. She observed him throughout, not with the disinterest of a child, nor the curiosity of a visitor, but with an ancient knowing, as if she had been present before, as if she had anticipated this very moment for longer than he had. Then, as Father John quietly uttered the sacred words, "This is my body," an extraordinary event occurred. A warm breeze, gentle yet unmistakable, swept through the stone chapel, emanating from the altar outwards. The candle flames flickered, and though the windows remained still, the walls seemed to inhale and exhale. Subsequently, a dull, resonant thud echoed, akin to a tree falling in a distant forest. Heads turned, though only 2 individuals were present. Above them, the statue of the Virgin Mary, which had been secured in its iron cradle for over a century, suddenly became dislodged, tilted forward, and began its descent. It fell more than 15 feet, striking the ground with considerable force, yet astonishingly, it did not shatter nor even sustain a chip. Instead, it landed as if gently placed, as though an unseen force had caught it mid-air and set it down with meticulous care. Father John stared in utter disbelief, his mouth agape, his knees trembling. The girl rose, approached the fallen statue with slow steps, knelt beside it, gently placed one hand upon Mary's feet, and then, before the priest could utter a word, she was gone. Vanished. No sound of footsteps, no opening of a door, no discernible trace remained, only the lingering image of a white dress in his memory and the statue on the floor, perfectly whole, utterly intact, and gazing upwards as if she had descended rather than fallen. For a full minute after the girl's disappearance, Father John remained frozen, his eyes fixed upon the statue, his hands trembling above the altar. The consecrated host lay untouched, the prayer left unfinished hanging in the profound silence. But no further words followed. No liturgical rite could proceed after such an inexplicable occurrence. The girl, the statue, the ethereal wind, none of it conformed to any rational understanding. Yet it felt more profoundly real than anything he had experienced in years. He slowly descended the altar steps and approached the fallen icon. There she lay, Our Lady of Grace, resting on her side upon the chapel floor, her arms still outstretched as if offering peace. Her eyes were cast slightly upward, her expression unchanged. There were no fractures, no chips, no marks, not even an indentation on the polished hardwood floor. She had fallen from a height exceeding 15 feet, yet the scene suggested she had been carefully laid down by invisible hands. Father John sank to his knees, not in alarm, nor even in awe, but in utter submission. For years he had preached to empty seats. Now, in the presence of a miracle and a profound mystery, all he could do was kneel and weep. The duration of his kneeling remained uncertain. Minutes passed. The incense had long since extinguished, and the candles flickered weakly. He remained immobile until he heard the familiar creak of the heavy wooden door once more. It was Mrs. Carol Maynard, a 73-year-old retired librarian who had not set foot in the church since her husband's funeral 10 years prior. Her steps were slow and deliberate, but upon glimpsing the priest kneeling beside the fallen statue, she halted abruptly in the doorway. "Father," she inquired, her voice frail, "what has happened?" "She fell," he whispered, his gaze still fixed on the statue, "but she did not break." Mrs. Maynard made the sign of the cross and stepped back, offering no further questions, her eyes wide with astonishment, her lips moving in silent prayer. News of the event spread with the speed of wildfire through tinder-dry conditions. Some recounted hearing about it via telephone, while others claimed to have felt an inexplicable shift in the atmosphere and were drawn to the chapel. Oddly enough, a few individuals reported dreaming of a young girl in white the previous night. One farmer insisted that his dog had begun howling that morning and would not cease until he accompanied it up the hill to the church. By sunset, over a dozen townspeople had gathered at the chapel's entrance. Some carried flowers, others brought candles, and many arrived with nothing but their bewilderment and a rekindled, though long dormant, faith. Father John had not dared to touch the statue. Instead, he had draped a clean white altar cloth over it, like a comforting blanket. Around the statue, the first bouquet arrived. Daisies from a young mother, followed by sunflowers from a widower, then lilies and roses. Each floral offering seemed to carry a sacred essence, grief, gratitude, a prayer too personal to be voiced aloud. That night, the chapel remained open, its occupants silent. People sat, knelt, wept, and simply gazed. The following day, the influx of visitors continued. By Tuesday, cars lined the gravel road descending the hill. By Wednesday, local news crews had established their presence outside. By Thursday, Individuals were arriving from neighboring counties. Some were drawn by mere curiosity, but the majority felt an unnameable stirring within them. There was no formal sermon or announcement, yet the miracle had become public knowledge, and Coldwater Ridge, a town that had almost forgotten how to pray, was experiencing a spiritual awakening. Father John never referred to the event as a miracle, nor did he assert that the girl was an angel or a spirit. He saw no need to. Something extraordinary had occurred, and its reality was undeniable. Amidst the burgeoning questions, the shared stories, and the return of the faithful, one element remained untouched at the epicenter of it all. The statue, still resting on the ground, intact, its gaze perpetually upward, and the space where the girl had knelt remained empty, though many would later attest to feeling a palpable warmth there, an unexplainable sensation when passing the third pew. Thus, the old chapel, which had once resonated with silence, began to breathe again. It started subtly, without fanfare, without celestial choirs, but with a young woman, barely in her 20s, making her way up the chapel hill, cradling a baby wrapped snugly in a flannel blanket. Her name was Maria Lopez, and she hailed from Mill Creek Hollow, a distance of nearly 4 miles. She was not Catholic and had not frequented a church in years. However, for 3 consecutive nights, she had experienced the same dream. A young girl in white standing beneath a luminous sky, urging her to bring your son to the lady. She will care for him. Maria did not fully comprehend the message. All she knew was that her infant son, Isaac, had not cried in days. His fever persisted, and the local physician had exhausted all remedies. She arrived shortly after dawn. The chapel was empty save for Father John, who was already kneeling beside the fallen statue. Maria spoke little, merely unwrapping her son and placing him on a small cushion before the Virgin, then falling to her knees. Her prayers were silent, her lips moving inaudibly, tears falling onto the stone floor. Her hands trembled as she clutched a rosary she didn't know how to use. Father John stood quietly behind her, offering no touch nor sermon, merely observing. By evening, the infant's fever had subsided. 2 days later, Maria returned to the chapel, her baby alert, his cheeks rosy, cooing as if nothing had ever been amiss. The physician at Mill Creek's clinic would later privately concede that he had no explanation for the recovery. The second account came from Joe and Mark Lanigan, brothers in their 60s who had not spoken to each other in 22 years. A legal dispute over a parcel of land had fractured their family, rendering them estranged despite living less than a mile apart. Joe arrived at the chapel midweek, unshaven, clutching an old Bible in one hand and a bouquet of sunflowers in the other. He gazed at the statue for nearly 20 minutes before kneeling. Later that same evening, he approached his brother's doorstep for the first time in over 2 decades. He did not knock, but simply stood there. Mark opened the door, met his brother's eyes, and without a word, embraced him. When questioned about his actions, Joe simply stated, "I heard her tell me, make peace. The lady wants peace." Following this, a cascade of similar stories emerged. A teenage girl with self-inflicted scars ceased her visits to the emergency room. A man who had struggled with alcoholism for 15 years reported feeling an invisible force hold his chest as he passed the chapel, dissipating the craving. A 9-year-old boy, previously plagued by a severe stutter, stood before the statue and read an entire page of scripture aloud without a single impediment. Even those with skeptical inclinations began to soften. Sheriff Don Russell, who had not attended church since the Clinton administration, was observed standing silently outside the chapel one evening, arms crossed, watching as a crowd of townsfolk entered. He did not enter himself, but remained for hours. When questioned about his presence, he simply remarked, "Because I've never seen this town like this, and I'm not going to miss it." The townsfolk no longer came merely to observe. They came to feel, to kneel, to weep, not from desperation, but from gratitude. They left notes, drawings, lockets, and photographs of departed loved ones beneath the statue. They whispered the names of those they had not forgiven, and then they extended forgiveness. The revival was not boisterous or widespread in the conventional sense, but it was undeniably genuine. Faith began to return, not like a sudden deluge, but like a slow, persistent river gradually finding its way back to the valley floor. Throughout this transformation, the statue remained unmoved. Father John steadfastly refused to return it to its iron cradle. "She came down to be with us," he explained to anyone who inquired, "and until she asks to be lifted, she shall remain." The townsfolk began referring to the statue as the lady who fell but did not break. However, those who had witnessed the event knew it was more accurate to say she had not fallen. She had descended. And from wherever she had come, she was achieving something utterly unexpected. She was breathing life back into Coldwater Ridge. The miracles continued, and with them the steady stream of visitors. Yet Father John Mallister found himself preoccupied with the memory of the girl. The one in white, who had sat silently in the third pew, approached the fallen statue, touched it with her small hand, and then vanished like morning mist. While the town buzzed with wonder and pilgrims lit candles and knelt with trembling hands, he remained haunted not by the statue itself, but by her eyes, dark and serene, ancient yet youthful, as if holding a secret the rest of the world had forgotten. Each night, after the last parishioner departed, Father John would sit in the third pew, alone, replaying every detail of that fateful morning. He pondered the specifics. What footwear had she worn? Had she uttered any words at all? How had she entered the chapel? And more impossibly, how had she departed? The following morning he commenced his inquiries. His initial step was to contact the local educational institutions, including elementary schools, middle schools, and even daycare centers. None reported a missing child matching her description, nor did any recognize his description. He proceeded to create a sketch, rendered quickly by a churchgoer with a talent for portraiture. Dark hair, a gentle smile, a white dress, and a wooden rosary. Still, no leads emerged. He broadened his search, delving into parish records, baptismal registers, Sunday school rosters, and old confirmation photographs. Every child who had been associated with the parish in the preceding 30 years was accounted for. She was not among them. Subsequently, he visited neighboring towns, stopping by orphanages, group homes, and shelters. He even consulted with the night shift dispatcher at the county sheriff's office. There were no reports of runaways, no missing persons, and no discernible clues. "She's not listed anywhere," he muttered one evening, standing in the church basement, his reading glasses perched precariously on his nose as he sifted through faded enrollment lists. Yet she had undeniably been there. 2 weeks later, a woman arrived just after the 6 o'clock Mass. She appeared to be in her 80s, enveloped in a knitted shawl, her silver hair tucked beneath a faded floral scarf. Her hands trembled as she held a weathered envelope. "Are you Father John?" she asked, her voice soft yet steady. He nodded. "My name is Eleanor Briggs. Folks just call me Miss Ellie. I think I know who the girl was." Within the envelope was a photograph, its corners softened and stained with age. The colors faded to a near sepia tone. The image depicted a young girl, approximately 10 years old, with dark hair, a white dress, and a wooden rosary. It was her. Father John's breath hitched. Where did you find this? Miss Ellie's gaze drifted down to her footwear, then back up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She was my granddaughter, she confided. Lucan Walker. She departed this world 17 years ago, struck by a pickup truck just beyond our town's limits on her return from Sunday catechism. A profound silence descended, settling heavily within the room. Father John slowly lowered himself onto the front pew, the photograph held with a tremor. September 8th, Miss Ellie's voice continued, her tone steady. That was the day she left us. The very same day she reappeared here, didn't she? He gave a slow nod, his throat too constricted to form words. She held the Virgin Mary in great affection, Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. She would offer prayers nightly. She called her Mama Mary. She always said that when she passed, she wanted Mary to be the first to embrace her. The priest could no longer hold back his tears. This was no mere ghost story, no spectral apparition. This was a child, once tangible, once vibrant with life, who had returned. She returned not with dread, but with gentle assurance, not to disturb, but to offer guidance. They mention they've dreamt of her, Miss Ellie said, her hands clasped tightly together. They say she reassures them, telling them not to be fearful, that the Blessed Mother still hears them. Father John finally raised his eyes, his voice low and quivering. Do you truly believe it was her? I possess no concrete evidence, Father, she replied, rising with deliberate slowness. But I have found a measure of peace, something I haven't experienced in 17 years. She placed the photograph into his hand and turned to depart. However, before she stepped out into the crisp evening air of the mountains, she uttered one final thought. If she returned, it wasn't solely for me. It was for all of us. That night, Father John carefully placed the photograph into a frame and set it gently beside the fallen statue, just beneath the outstretched hands of the Virgin. There was no inscription, no formal declaration, yet anyone who drew near could sense it. This girl, this child of the hills, was an integral part of a profound occurrence. From that moment forward, even the most skeptical began to softly speak her name, Lucy. It wasn't an immediate chorus of voices. The dreams arrived like hushed whispers, subtle, infrequent, seemingly without pattern. A nurse at the Cold Water Ridge Clinic was among the first to voice her experience. She had remained late after a demanding shift, succumbing to slumber on a couch in the break room. In her dream, a young girl, dressed in white, stood at the far end of a hospital corridor, her feet bare, her hands joined in supplication. Her voice, though soft as a breeze, resonated with crystalline clarity. She can still hear you, even when you believe she isn't listening. The nurse, deeply unsettled, recorded these words the following morning. She didn't recognize the child until a patient presented her with a flyer featuring Lucy's photograph from the chapel. A chill permeated her as she realized it was her, she murmured. The second significant dream came to a 17-year-old named Ethan Miller, a boy known for his quiet demeanor and struggles with depression. He seldom spoke and hadn't set foot in a church since his father's funeral. One morning, his mother discovered him seated at the kitchen table, his eyes wide with a profound realization, his hands trembling, tears coursing down his cheeks. She told me not to do it, he managed to convey. Initially, his mother was bewildered, but then he produced a crumpled suicide note from his hoodie pocket, which he then burned. He never disclosed the entirety of the dream, only that the girl had taken his hand, met his gaze, and imparted, "Tell Father John more are coming. Do not be afraid." Following this, the children began to share their experiences. A 6-year-old girl named Addie, who was not yet able to read or write, entered the chapel one afternoon, clutching a piece of paper. Upon it was a crayon depiction, the Virgin Mary descending in a shaft of golden radiance, her arms extended, and beside her a small girl in white, holding hands with individuals of all ages, guiding them towards the church. When questioned about who had instructed her to create this image, Addie simply offered a shrug. "No one," she stated. "She showed me." Within that same week, a Vietnam veteran from the town's outskirts came forward. He had grappled with recurring nightmares for decades. However, that particular night, for the first time, he experienced a dream filled with tranquility, a silence devoid of fear, a light unburdened by judgment. "She uttered no words," he told Father John, his weathered eyes reflecting the moisture of tears. "She simply stood there by the statue, looking at me, and in that moment I understood I was absolved." Initially, Father John meticulously recorded each account in a small, leather-bound journal. He felt at a loss for any other course of action. The bishop had provided no clarification, and the media had already moved on. Yet, the townspeople continued to dream, and the messages persisted. Some offered cautionary advice, others solace, but all conveyed a consistent sentiment, a gentle urgency, a profound tenderness, a shared essence. Lucy herself never claimed any divine status. She was not a saint adorned in vestments. She remained consistently a child, yet a child imbued with an aura of the eternal. One night, Father John too found himself in a dream. The dream placed him within the chapel, which was bathed in a warm, golden, and soft light. Lucy was seated in the third pew, her hands clasped, facing the altar. No words were exchanged between them, but as she turned to meet his gaze, a profound sensation washed over him, simultaneously breaking his heart and mending it. There was an understanding in her eyes, as if she perceived every hidden doubt he harbored, every moment he'd considered surrendering, every silent plea he'd never vocalized. And in spite of it all, she loved him. Upon awakening, he wept as a child might, not from apprehension or elation, but from an overwhelming awareness that he was not solitary. The collective dreams began to weave the town together. Individuals who had previously been strangers now shared their narratives over coffee in the chapel's lower hall. Families presented journals filled with handwritten dream accounts. Teenagers sought confession without any prompting. And the atmosphere in Coldwater Ridge, once stagnant and oppressive, began to transform. A new kind of quiet permeated the church, a silence not of vacancy, but of presence. It felt as though the very walls had become attentive, as if an unseen entity had established its dwelling there, someone or something that had arrived not to astound or to instill fear, but to gently awaken, to murmur softly in the darkness, "You are still cherished, and it is not too late." Prior to these events, Our Lady of Grace had been little more than a neglected artifact. Its white paint flaked like aging snow, and the bell tower listed as if weary. On most Sundays, the solitary sound that echoed through its wooden beams was Father John's lone voice, reverberating off the walls. The chapel carried the scent of aged wax, damp stone, and diminishing hope. But now a palpable change had occurred. It wasn't a singular, grand manifestation. There were no dramatic illuminations, no vast revival tents, no billboards along the highway. The transformation was subtle, akin to dew settling just before dawn. Yet it was pervasive. It began at the entrances. Whereas before, only a handful of people would enter, the doors now remained perpetually open. From morning until night, individuals moved in and out. Some knelt, some wept, while others simply sat in the third pew where the girl had been, absorbing the profound quiet. Then came the sounds. Not the familiar, hollow reverberations of emptiness, but music. A young man named Caleb, who hadn't played the piano since his brother's funeral, inquired if he might perform during the evening service. He began with a single hymn, then progressed to two, and soon the entire congregation joined in. Their voices, though perhaps cracked and tearful, imbued every note with life. The confessional, once relegated to storage, was cleared and reopened. Lines began to form. Individuals who hadn't confessed in 2 decades stood patiently, awaiting their turn. With nothing but their personal histories in hand, they were finally prepared to unburden themselves. On Wednesdays, the downstairs kitchen once again buzzed with activity. This was not for fundraising events, bake sales, or parish committee gatherings, but for a far simpler purpose: soup, bread, and warmth. The churchwomen, formerly known as the Flower Guild, now embraced the moniker the table. They served nourishing meals to anyone who entered, without inquiry or formalities, offering only a plate and a seat. God doesn't inquire about your zip code before providing sustenance, one of them remarked humorously. By the 3rd week, the statue of Our Lady remained on the ground. Not a single person suggested its reinstatement into the iron niche. No one dared. There was a compelling presence in viewing her at eye level, resting on folded fabric, surrounded by an array of candles and wildflowers gathered from nearby meadows. She had descended, and now she was among them. Children frequently gathered near her, sometimes whispering to her, sometimes leaving drawings. One boy gifted her a toy soldier, his only possession, explaining it was to protect her. Lucy's photograph was gently placed within a frame and positioned beside the statue. There was no plaque, no name, no explanation, and yet everyone understood. They referred to her as the little guide, the one who had led them back, the one who whispered in dreams and clasped trembling hands. She became an integral part of the church, not as a legend, but as a living presence, something sacred yet familiar, like a beacon in the mist. Father John ceased delivering sermons from the pulpit. Instead, he descended to the floor, mingling with his congregation. His homilies transformed into narratives rather than pronouncements. He no longer addressed the congregation from afar, but engaged directly with them. Occasionally, he would weep, and at other times, others would. But each instance, the subsequent silence felt hallowed, not hollow, as if the divine itself had spoken and required no repetition. People began to journey from neighboring towns, then from other counties. Some sought to witness a miracle, but the majority sought something more elusive to define. Peace. Not the peace derived from explanations, but from presence. From the understanding that the heavens were closer than they imagined, and that perhaps, just perhaps, they had touched the earth. Even the skeptics occupied the rear pews. Truck drivers, nurses, men who had previously scoffed at the notion of angels. They did not all kneel, nor did they all make the sign of the cross, but they remained longer than anticipated. And as they departed, their hands trembled, their gazes lingered. Something had been stirred within them, even if they couldn't articulate what it was. Cold Water Ridge ceased to be merely a point on a map. It evolved into a nexus for the wounded and the hopeful, for dreamers and the unconvinced, for those who had lost their faith and those who had never possessed it but arrived, nonetheless, drawn by the knowledge that something had fallen but not shattered, something had perished but been resurrected, and a whisper had carried the message, "It is not finished. Grace remains present." 3 weeks had elapsed since the statue's descent, and still, Our Lady of Grace rested upon the ground, settled on folded white linen, her gaze gently directed upwards, enveloped by the quietude of candlelight and the soft murmur of prayers uttered through tears. No one had attempted to reposition her, nor was it even suggested any more, for deep down they understood she had not fallen, she had descended. Father John never assigned a specific designation to the event. He never claimed it as an apparition, a miracle, or a vision. It was unnecessary. He simply conveyed the truth to the people, that on a misty September morning, during a sparsely attended mass, a girl had entered the chapel and Grace had followed. He often found himself standing by the statue during the quiet evening hours, long after the visitors had departed, when the air within was thick with incense and remembrance. Sometimes he offered prayers. Other times he remained silent, but he always felt it, the undeniable certainty that he was not alone. One afternoon he discovered a small, meticulously folded note tucked beneath the statue, penned in a child's handwriting. "Dear Mary, if you wish, you can be my mother too. I don't have one here." Beside it lay a pink plastic hair clip, likely belonging to a backpack or a playground. Small, ordinary, and profoundly sacred. There was no official proclamation, yet word had spread far beyond the confines of Cold Water Ridge. Visitors arrived from neighboring states, armed with folded maps, lingering grief, and tentative hope. They carried photographs of children who were lost, medals commemorating soldiers who had departed too soon, wedding bands, and well-worn Bibles. However, they did not seek answers, they sought gifts. And the moment they crossed the threshold, a subtle shift occurred. A quietude that was not of emptiness, but of invitation. More than once, a visitor would pass the third pew, pause, and slowly turn, as if sensing something, as if someone had brushed past them, as if a child's gaze had just met their own. While proof remained elusive, it was also unnecessary. For faith, true faith, requires no substantiation. It needs only to be received. One Sunday, a young boy stood beside the statue and declared audibly, "She came down because she didn't want to look at us from way up there anymore." Father John, observing from a distance, offered a quiet smile, for in those simple words a profound mystery had been articulated. The statue hadn't fallen. It had descended to walk among them, to kneel beside the grieving, to stand with the forgotten, to grasp the hand of a child and whisper into the stillness, "I am here." And so the chapel underwent a transformation. The altar was no longer merely a table. It became a convergence point between the celestial and the terrestrial, between sorrow and healing, between the prayers we dare to voice and those too sacred to utter aloud. The girl in white was never seen again. Yet those who had dreamt of her, wept with her, or perceived her voice in the profound stillness, did not forget. Her photograph continued to rest beside the Virgin, and occasionally someone would place a daisy or a crayon drawing at its base, as if she were a saint or a sister, or perhaps both. Now, when the chapel bell tolls, it is not a call to ritual. It rings as a reminder to the world that grace descended and remained. Not to orchestrate a spectacle, but to transform a community, not to dazzle with extraordinary displays, but to accompany ordinary individuals within a forgotten church nestled in a quiet valley where a statue once stood tall and then chose to draw near. For heaven does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it descends, and when it does, understanding is not required. Only kneeling is necessary.